And we are dissecting impact farming as an asset class and a potential avenue for investment. You can share some of your thoughts and comments with us on our Twitter handle at 405business_. Use the hashtag BusinessUnusual. Our WhatsApp line is on 072-110-5584. I'm still in conversation with the chief economist at the National Agricultural Marketing Council, Dr Sifiso Ntombela. Now, Dr Sifiso, just during the break, you were touching on something very interesting, and I think our conversation is not just about that investor who's our viewer who just wants to invest whatever money they might have. It's also to the entrepreneur who's watching the show who might be looking for a market opportunity to garner this kind of peer-to-peer investment. And you're seeing some interesting trends when it comes to unused erstwhile mining land.
Yes. So one of the things which we're seeing, because especially in the agriculture, maybe let me start by putting this to just give a little bit of context. So South African agriculture, for any typical developing country, is dualistic in nature. So you have very viable, large, well-resourced commercial farms.
Heavily mechanized. Yeah.
Heavily mechanized and having well-established network into domestic and global markets. But you have these emerging farmers, some of it are doing very well, some of it are really doing badly, that have suffered of hundreds of years of exclusion into the sector.
Yeah.
But some of these farmers are situated in the high potential land areas, and some of them closer into the previously land that was owned by the mining areas, especially in the former rural areas. So what we see as a very great potential, and some of it that can link into some of these district developmental model, where you actually bring up development from a regional base level to tackle with this issue of inequality part of it. We're seeing that some opportunities where farmers use some creative joint ventures with the big mining corporations, where some of the land that used to belong in the olden days in the mining corporation that is lying fallow, probably planted with some forestry parts, that they are getting into joint ventures where they can be able to acquire that kind of land and turn it and develop it into agricultural products. Now, that has two spillover effects from agricultural entrepreneurs. Because first of all, you're acquiring land probably at a very cost competitive price. Sure. But you are turning it, so you're increasing the value of that land and you're contributing to the food security and creation of employment. But remember, we are also a very water scarce country. So by turning some of that land that used to be under forestation, you are turning in the classification of it, so you are able to sort of harvest some of the water, and you turn that land and be able to generate water that now, instead of being a water scarce, you are able now to move from forestry to agriculture, and you are able to withdraw some of the water licensing that you need to.
And the water use of forestry is a bit more than what you would in agriculture. Yeah.
Absolutely. So then these are some of the ventures that you are seeing, and with more water, you are able to even turn this land and make it under irrigation so that you can increase your yields, some of these things. And we're seeing these kind of joint ventures as the key, especially in developing some of the areas and the farmers that wants to tap into the agricultural sector and become the new players of it. Because now in those areas, even the poor municipalities are able to negotiate that kind of contracts, and they're able to give those opportunities to some of the new guys that can be able to enter into the sector.
Because they know they can get future revenue.
Absolutely. So these are some of the things that we're hoping are not only just going to benefit those that already been benefiting in the sector, but you will see that true inclusive growth into the sector, and with new players taking more share into the agricultural sector.
I like how you mentioned that alongside the district-centered development model, because in many ways you're giving practical effect to this idea that you can have a bottom-up form of development using agricultural land, or which was formerly mine land. But also it speaks to this challenge of how do we rehabilitate many of the areas that have now become ghost towns. I mean, if you go to many places in the West Rand, that land is there, but in effect what has happened is that the economic linkages in those areas have effectively died.
Absolutely, absolutely. And some of these things, because when we deregulated the sector, we all focus on the globalization of the sector and what are the markets. And somehow we're much driven by the trickle-down economics principles. And in agricultural sector, other colleagues from the industry can say, look, some of the sectors we have seen the trickle-down effect.
Sure.
But in agriculture sector, you can argue, and there's ample evidence to show that it's not benefited most.
Yeah.
So this bottom-up approach is able to then link up with the network that you've created at a global scale, and ensuring that you create that massive capacity at the local level. Now, not only linking up with the value chains, what it also does it's able to create some spillover effect and revitalize your second economic industries. In the long term, what that will do, it will start relieving pressure from the metros as people will migrate back into this.
And diversify where our growth
diversifying on those things. And we're hoping other colleagues, especially in the government sectors, on other sectors like the branch line and the transport system, because then that can allow to unlock that growth and move the commodities to the land sector. But also the financing part of it, which we've been talking about in this chain, to say, how do you come up with some creative solution of investing that can de-risk these things? So it's a
fascinating things you're raising here, Doc. And I guess I want to come back to an issue you raised earlier on, which is around R&D and the impact that that has on productivity and, of course, the profitability of many of these investments. Are you seeing an emergence of R&D opportunities and investment opportunities in R&D that is linked to issues of climate adaptation, climate mitigation? Because we've seen in our region, you don't have to go too far. In KZN, we saw the floods that happened there. We saw the challenges in Mozambique and Zimbabwe and in Malawi, which are major agricultural areas in our SADC region. And I mean, it shouldn't be surprising if you think about the drought and the massive impact that that has had on us here. So from a climate perspective, are we seeing investment being channeled to some knowledge and insights and R&D that can not only allow us to improve productivity, yields and profitability, but also to mitigate some of the big risks that continue to be challenges in the sector?
We're certainly seeing a lot of need and some investment coming up into the R&D part of it. And it's two trends that are very worrying, at least from my perspective. So we used to have, we still do, Agricultural Research Council.
Yes,
and I think 15 or 20 years ago, anyone within the sector would have argued it was the best ranked research council in the world.
Yes.
And used to come up with some of these innovation, new technologies, adaptation techniques, and the new cultivars. But the unfortunate part of that is that the state have let that institution deteriorate by underfunding that institution. So that's the first part of it. In so doing, we have let some of the facilities degenerate and some of the equipment that we used to have are no longer in good function. So that can easily be fixed in the next 2 or 3 years. But the biggest risk that we've seen is that during that period, we have lost a lot of skilled people. Now, these are the researchers that have acquired decades and decades of research capacity that have now either left the country or went to the private sector. And you are unable to get that skill back into agri sector. So that privatization of skill is really hitting the sector currently, which we're seeing why our competitiveness to some of the commodities are reducing. But having said that, there are some positive spillover because the government is starting to change the attitude toward that institution. But we also see, because the private sector saw that gap, we're able to do some very lucrative investment in R&D. I could mention some of the ones that is sitting in the Stellenbosch areas where they're looking at the fruit fly sterilization facilities that has to deal with the issues of phytosanitary and sanitary issues within the fruit industry.
It's a big issue globally, yeah.
Absolutely, so that they can get into that. But they're also coming in and around the issue of carbon labeling so that you are able to track your emission within your commodity. So as you're sitting here, you're able to say if you're eating an apple, how much of emission from the time on the farm. Absolutely, and that allows us to now be able to comply with SPS and TB